It's 1 a.m. everybody, welcome back, and you know what that means? You get a slightly unscripted, well entirely unscripted, but slightly more coherent version of my usual 3 a.m. videos. Look at you! With that being said, today's video is primarily going to go over Arknights and Genshin Impact, and primarily just the entirety of gacha games as a whole. Because I've been studying a bunch of them. I started out Tower Fantasy over again. I've started out with Arknights. I've started out Azure Lane just to get a different perspective on that game since I really don't understand what's going on. I'm going to restart Blue Archive and so on. And I think it's incredibly important to talk about the new player experience, and I briefly kind of touched on this in yesterday's video or the day before that. I don't know exactly when you're seeing this. But new player experiences are incredibly difficult to nail, and communities impact that to a degree, but I think it's also very important to consider just how good an introduction the game itself gives you. And depending on what type of player you are and how much time you have, obviously your experience with these games can differ. You might want a much faster tutorial, that way you can just get into the game and then decide to come back once your stamina is replenished. Alternatively, you may have a bunch of time on your hands, and if you do, you may be appreciative of a much longer tutorial and introduction to the game and to its world because you have the time available to devote into that. So I'm going to be speaking about this from my own perspective. I do leave, I do go to school, I do go to work, I do have my own things outside of this YouTube stuff, so I do have time that can be spent to gaming constantly. However, I also have quite a lot of free time that I can devote to games, whether that be on the weekends and throughout the week. So I'm in a bit of a scenario where I do appreciate games that have a much faster tutorial, but I also appreciate games that start out slowly, introduce you to a bunch of concepts, and then allow you to do as you please. With that being said, some of these games have an amazing tutorial, but awful mechanics that aren't necessarily explained to you. And if you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you know that I primarily play Genshin, Blue Archive, Arknights, and I have dabbled in other gacha games here and there. New player experiences are incredibly difficult to nail, not just because of the time differences that I've mentioned previously, but because you have a lot of players that will either skip through because they don't see the importance in early game tutorials because tutorials are so easy most of the time, or a lot of the things that you can do, or oftentimes that I've seen before, is that games will overwhelm you with a bunch of new concepts and new material and new information that you don't necessarily need until much later on. This means that the player is probably going to forget about that in the long run, but if you introduce it too late in the game, they're probably so used to the mechanics of it that they probably don't care. At a certain extent, players kind of get set in their own ways, they know how their account plays, and they know what they want to do, so when you try introducing a new mechanic, it kind of gets tossed under the rug, or at least swept under there, because they don't want to shift their accounts around or shift the current playstyle around to accommodate for that. And after discussing this with a couple more individuals who do play other gacha games, one of the conclusions we came to was Arknights is a perfect example of this. Now, Arknights is a game that I have mentioned before I do like, and I do play, and I am playing it pretty much every day, if not every other day. But Arknights has an iffy tutorial in my opinion. Now, this isn't because the game doesn't try to teach you this. The game has a lot of tutorials, but the problem is that with those tutorials spread so far out throughout the game cycle and with new enemies being introduced much later on, a lot of times you already have a team composition that you already like, you have a squad that you use, and you really don't want to try and fit characters in, or if you do, you may forget to take them out, and you'll be doing a lot of rearranging. Alternatively, there's the issue in that Arknights has a bunch of branches between different classes. If you're talking about guards alone, you have the standardized guards, you have duelists, you have lords, you have arts guards, and don't get me wrong, there are many more. And I'm not the best person to be explaining all this, but if I'm just basing it off this alone, you do have issues in which if you are a player who's just kind of setting up your team based on what classes they are, i.e. you want vanguards, you want defenders, you want guards, you want casters, and snipers, and so on, you're in a position in which you may not understand the branch that your character comes from, and ultimately that may lead you to make mistakes later on. If you're using a guard that is a duelist and only blocks one unit at a time, it may basically lead you to be kind of confused as to why your guard blocks less than your vanguard. Or you may not understand why certain vanguards like Myrtle are better than others. And this isn't necessarily something that the game teaches you, because the game really doesn't have to and shouldn't in most ways go over individual units, but the classes and the branches aren't necessarily taught enough. The difference between guards is something that you have to learn yourself. And if you don't understand that and don't understand what characters you use have arts damage that can deal with them, whether that be passively or based on a skill, it's a bit difficult. An example is I use Lapland quite a lot because I like the fact that she can deal arts damage, and that's great for when high defense enemies are popping up in front of her. But if I don't know that, then it's a bit of a difficult situation in which I'm looking at my guards and I'm kind of wondering who to use for certain scenarios, and I'm picking them based off either the block count or the amount of attack they have. You also have newer units like Horn, who's currently on banner, at least at the time of me making this video. I have Horn, I like her, she's great, but if you're an individual who's not searching it up constantly on YouTube, you don't necessarily know what she does and why she's such a good defender. And at the same time, it makes it very difficult to make an educated decision on pulling for a unit just based off opinions alone. Because you could hear a unit being, ranted and raved about being amazing, but not understand what makes them amazing yourself because you don't have the ability to test them out or really find out if they're going to fit into your current squad. I don't want to make this about Arknights alone, but I am an individual who's been playing it a lot more recently, so it's probably going to be the focal point for a couple more videos in the future as I move on. I do want to play a different gacha game every month. However, with this being said, Arknights has a difficulty spike. From chapters or episodes 1 and 2 all the way up to 3, there's a very wide margin of difficulty. The original first 1 and 2 are easy. 3, a lot of different things are introduced to you early on that you haven't necessarily had to deal with. And it really does push your understanding of the game, because early on, you can brute force your way through a lot of the content, at least in my opinion. I am an individual who has Golden Glow. She's been curing me. I have Skyfire, I have Lapland, Warfarin, Horn, and so on. So I have a variety of units that can deal good damage in most situations. But one of the things that I like to consider here is that I necessarily didn't have to worry about this. I knew that I could reliably plop down Texas on front as a vanguard in the beginning of the match or the beginning of the stage, and then Lapland behind her, and they would do pretty well. Golden Glow to support them alongside a Warfarin and Ansel or whoever else was nearby on my medic side that I could use, and at worst case scenario I could throw down a Liskarm or a Horn now to defend. But the difficulty spike is a pretty drastic one, because going from the end of episode 2 into episode 3, there's a very wide difference because you have invisible enemies that are now attacking you from a distance. You have mortars being thrown in. You have boss enemies that are just kind of thrown in there here and there. And don't get me wrong, they're there, but they're more than you previously would have had to deal with. You now have to worry about multiple different defending points, and I've done Annihilation, so I am vaguely used to that. But it's still a jarring switch in that the mechanics you previously didn't ever have to worry about now are such a big factor that you have to learn them then and there. And individuals are going to say, hey, that's on the player. You should have memorized that, or you should have learned that when the game first taught you. And to a degree, you're right. But the problem is, you can't expect a player to learn a concept that isn't necessary. Because most of the time when you're meeting a high defense enemies, you throw down a caster. And that is still the case later on. The problem is, you throw down that caster and you don't know your guard might deal art damage. They might not. You haven't had to check that out, and sure, you're probably elite wanting operators too, but then again, that promotion isn't fully explained to you. It's kind of just said, hey, they gain a new skill, and you're not necessarily taught a lot of things. Like the fact that your units have a default skill in which they're going to alternate towards when you put them into a squad. And so a lot of times, even if you do elite one an operator, you're left with a unit that's still using the skill 1 as opposed to skill 2. And this overall, in my opinion, culminates in Arknights having a great experience overall, sure, but there's a difficulty spike and mechanics that aren't necessarily well explained unless you have someone else to explain them to you, or you have a cracked account to begin with. Blue Archive does a terrible job, in my opinion, of explaining a lot of the mechanics to you, so a lot of players are left very confused. Like the environment system, they understand the basics as in, hey, this blue mystic enemy does great damage to other mystic opponents. Or hey, your character is weak to units that deal with this type of damage. So I do understand that a lot of Blue Archive players are lost and confused, and hey, I am too, which is why I'm restarting there to make a kind of guide and series of me trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing. But I think it's very important to consider a new player experience. Obviously, the longer you've been playing a game, whether that's from launch or whether you've been playing it for a year or even a couple months, you're going to understand things that newer players won't. But I think it's very important to not forget that difficult learning curve you might have had early on, or just how difficult the start of a game can be, or how overwhelming it can be. I'm an individual who, if you've watched this channel, you know I like Genshin Impact. Genshin Impact has the best new player experience out of these 3 games. And look, you see, I understand you might not like the game, however, it's my channel and YouTube removed the dislike button, so I don't care. But I think it's incredibly important to consider what a new player is going to go through in any gacha game when they're first starting out, in any game whatsoever. And I think linear games have a much easier time, or even just full-priced games that have separate multiplayer or separate instances and separate modes, have a much easier time introducing this to you because they know the path and the resources you have access to. Gacha games, you could pull a brand new unit and not understand a single thing about them, and depending on what time and what type of game you're playing, they might be the most complex in the game. And that can severely alter your perception of the experience overall, especially if that unit is extremely broken. If they're really good, they can make the game such an easy experience where you don't necessarily need to learn these things. And is it a fault on the players and on the developers' end at that point? Are you as a player held liable for summoning for a unit and then using them even though that unit is extremely good? Or are you as a developer held liable for not being able to account for the fact that a player may have summoned for a brand new, really powerful unit? I think it's a weird situation to be in, and I understand why many gacha games don't necessarily have good tutorials because they can't account for you having certain characters, but I think there's better ways to go about it than what's currently available in both Blue Archive and Arknights. And this isn't to say that Genshin is the best gacha game out there or whatever the case may be, but it is to say that it has the better new player experience, at least in terms of introducing to the game itself. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. What was your first gacha game? How was the player experience that you had back then? If you enjoyed, leave a like on the video down below, consider subscribing, and hey, hope to see you next time. Goodbye.